She was known around the naval base in Coronado simply as the unit's mechanic. Her name was Senior Chief Petty Officer Valeria Val Kowalski, and while the SEALs she worked with were the ones getting all the tattoos and the glory, Val was the one who kept their lifeline running. She was a master technician with the Naval Special Warfare Command, a woman in her late 30s with calloused hands, sharp gray eyes, and a practical mind that could diagnose an engine problem faster than a doctor could diagnose a cold. The operators she worked with trusted her implicitly, not because she was friendly, she was often short-tempered and blunt, but because she was brilliant. If Val signed off on an engine, a weapons system, or a communications array, it was going to work, no matter what hell it got dropped into. For the past 3 years, then Val had been the primary civilian contractor, though she held a senior chief rate, attached to a highly decorated SEAL platoon, often referred to as the wild cards. She was their shadow, their guardian angel made of grease and ball bearings. While they trained for close-quarters combat and reconnaissance, she trained for the inevitable moment when a .50 caliber round would puncture a radiator, or an IED would fry the electronics of their desert patrol vehicles, DPVs. She didn't carry a rifle on her back as a primary weapon. She carried a fully loaded tool belt and a tablet diagnostic tool. Her job was to get them in and out of the bad places. She had her own quarters in the hangar bay of the amphibious transport dock they deployed on, a space filled with the smell of diesel and the hum of industrial fans. It was there, in the oily quiet, that she felt most at peace. Her current assignment was a joint operation with a CIA paramilitary team in the Shock Valley of Nuristan province, a place so remote and hostile that the maps were mostly guesswork. The objective was to observe and dismantle a high-value Taliban network facilitating the movement of Iranian-made anti-aircraft weapons. The SEALs would insert via helicopter under the cover of darkness, establish a hide site on the mountain ridge overlooking the village, and wait. Val's job was to remain at the initial insertion point, a small flat clearing a few clicks from the target, with one of the unit's 2 DPVs. It was a stripped-down, heavily armed dune buggy on steroids, designed for speed and maneuverability. The plan was that if things went sideways, the SEALs would aggress on foot to her position, so when she would drive them like hell out of the kill zone. The insertion was textbook. The MH-47 Chinook's rotors chopped the thin, cold air as it skimmed the ridgeline, dropping the 8-man team and Val into the moonlit gravel of the landing zone, LZ. The SEALs, led by Lieutenant Commander Jason Havoc Harris, melted into the shadows without a word. Val, left alone with the DPV, backed it into a crevice between 2 massive boulders, draping camouflage netting over the vehicle and herself. She then sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, the silence so absolute it had a physical weight. She could see the distant pinpricks of light from the village miles below and to the east. She waited. This was the job. Hours of excruciating boredom punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. For the first 18 hours, as the radio net was silent except for the occasional click of a squelch, the SEALs' way of saying, still alive. Val passed the time by running diagnostics on the DPV's onboard computer, checking the tire pressure, and mentally cataloging the ammunition for the mounted M240 machine gun she was qualified to use, but hoped she'd never have to. She thought about her small apartment back in San Diego, the potted plant on her balcony that was probably dead by now, and her father, a retired auto mechanic who had taught her that machines weren't just metal. They had personalities. A well-maintained engine hummed with contentment. A neglected one coughed with resentment. On the morning of the second day, the sky began to lighten from black to a bruised purple. So Val was just about to brew a cup of instant coffee using a portable heater when the radio crackled to life. It wasn't a click. It was Havoc's voice, low and controlled, but with an edge she had never heard before. "Kowalski, this is Wildcard 6. We've been compromised. I say again, compromised. We are taking effective fire. Exfil Route Alpha is hot. Stand by. Val's blood ran cold. She grabbed her headset. Copy 6. Standing by. She looked at the DPV, its engine cold, its tires firm. A compromised mission in this terrain was a death sentence. The valleys were steep, the trails were narrow, and the enemy knew every rock and crevice. The radio erupted again, this time with the frantic chatter of the SEALs on the ground. She heard the distinct crack of AK-47s, the deeper thump of RPG launches, and the shouted directions of the men she had shared coffee with, fixed their vehicles, and argued with about baseball. They were pinned down, they were falling back, and they were being hunted. Time became a strange, elastic thing. Val sat in the DPV, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, listening to her friends die by degrees over the radio. The initial plan was for them to break contact and move to a secondary LZ for an emergency extraction. But then she heard the words that made her stomach drop. We have wounded. Repeat, we have wounded. Can't move. Need fire support. Need a miracle. The helicopter support was at least 40 minutes out. The Air Force CAS, close air support, was stacked over a different valley. The wild cards were alone on a mountainside, bleeding out. Havoc's voice came back on. He directed solely at her. Kowalski, they're hurting us. They know we're here. They're going to push us off the cliff. Don't come for us. That's an order. Protect the tech. Get the intel out. Val listened to the order. She heard the sincerity in it. Havoc was trying to save her life. She looked at the DPV. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a 2,500-pound blunt instrument wrapped in a steel frame with a top speed of 80 miles per hour over rough terrain. She looked at her tool belt. Then she looked at the mountain where, in her mind's eye, she could see her friends dying. She thought of her father's voice. A machine is only as good as the person driving it. She keyed the mic. -6, I'm coming to get you. Pop smoke when you hear the engine. I'm going to be the loudest. The most distracting thing on this mountain. She didn't wait for a reply. She ripped the camo netting off, fired up the diesel engine, which roared to life with a satisfying growl, and popped the clutch. The DPV shot out from between the boulders like a sprinter off the blocks. Val had no helmet, no body armor heavier than the standard plate carrier she'd thrown on. She had her mechanic's coveralls, a pair of ballistic sunglasses, and a grim determination. She didn't take the path the SEALs had used to climb up. That was narrow and exposed. Instead, she took the DPV straight up the goat trail the enemy was using to flank the SEALs. It was insane. The vehicle bounced and slammed against rocks that threatened to tear the axles out. Val shifted gears with one hand, steering with the other, her body absorbing the shocks. And the first sign that she had entered the battle zone was the whiz of a bullet past her ear, so close she felt the wind. Then another. Small arms fire. The enemy had spotted the lone vehicle charging up the mountain. Val didn't slow down. She drove directly at the source of the fire. As she crested a small ridge, she saw them. A cluster of 5 insurgents in a firing line, their backs to her, focused on the SEALs' position higher up. They never heard her coming over the sound of their own guns. The DPV, weighing nearly 3 tons with its fuel and gear, hit them like a freight train. There was a sickening thud, the crunch of metal on bone, and the vehicle lurched as it rode over the debris. Val didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the terrain, her jaw set so tight it ached. She had just killed 5 men without firing a shot. There was no time to process it. The mechanic was now the weapon. She drove deeper into the chaos. The radio was screaming. "Val, what the hell was that?" Havoc yelled. "That was the cavalry," she yelled back. "Where are you?" They guided her by the sound of the engine. She drove the DPV up slopes that seemed vertical, the engine whining in protest, the tires spitting gravel into the abyss. She found them in a shallow depression behind a rock wall. 2 of the 8 were down. One, a man named Murphy, had a sucking chest wound. Another, Roberts, had his leg shredded by shrapnel. The other 5, including Havoc, were providing suppressing fire, their faces black with soot and fatigue, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief as they saw the mechanic behind the wheel. "You crazy son of a bitch!" Havoc screamed, on a grin splitting his face. "Get the wounded in!" Val was already out of the driver's seat, her mechanic's brain switching to combat medic mode. She had no medical training, but she knew how to move heavy parts. She and Havoc grabbed Murphy, his blood slick on her gloves, and heaved him into the back of the DPV, strapping him to the frame where they usually carried fuel cans. Roberts crawled in on his own, dragging his ruined leg. Just as they were loading the last of the able-bodied SEALs onto the vehicle's running boards and hood, the world exploded. An RPG round slammed into the rock face 10 feet away. The shockwave knocked Val off her feet. She landed hard on her back, the wind knocked out of her. She looked up to see the enemy pouring over the top of the ridge. There weren't just a handful. There were dozens. They were screaming, as their black turbans and beards framing faces contorted with rage. This wasn't a squad. It was a company. Havoc was right. They had been herded into a killing box. Val scrambled to her feet. The DPV was still running. Havoc was firing his M4 one-handed, dragging Roberts with the other. "Go, Val! Drive! Get them out of here!" he screamed, shoving Roberts toward the vehicle and turning back to face the onslaught. He was going to stay behind. He was going to die. Val looked at the DPV. She looked at the bleeding men in the back. She looked at Havoc, who was already walking backwards up the hill, firing. And then she saw it. The M240 machine gun mounted on the roll bar of the DPV. It was her vehicle. She maintained it. She knew its feed mechanism, its rate of fire, its soul. She didn't think. She moved. She vaulted into the driver's seat. But instead of putting it in gear to drive away, she spun the wheel, whipping the back of the vehicle around so the machine gun faced the enemy. She locked the brakes, leaped from the driver's seat to the gun mount in a move that would have made an Olympic gymnast jealous, and grabbed the charging handle. "Get down!" she screamed. She had never fired this weapon in combat. She had only test-fired it on the range, ensuring the rounds fed properly. But the mechanics were the same. Point, shoot, walk the fire. She pressed the butterfly trigger. The M240 roared to life, a deep, throaty, punishing sound. The first burst of 7.62mm rounds tore into the first wave of attackers, dropping them where they stood. The recoil shook Val's entire body, her teeth rattling in her skull, but she held on. She traversed the gun, sweeping it left to right, a right to left, creating a wall of lead. The brass casings flew past her face, hot and sharp, but she didn't flinch. Havoc stopped walking backward. He stared dumbfounded as the mechanic, the woman who usually carried a wrench, was single-handedly holding off an army. Val's world narrowed to the sight picture. The enemy was trying to spread out, to flank her. She saw them moving behind rocks, trying to get angles. She fired on them. She emptied a 100-round belt, and then another. The barrel started to glow red, the heat shimmer distorting the air. "Changing barrels!" she yelled, a phrase she had heard in movies. She had spare barrels in the vehicle kit. She yanked the hot one off with her gloved hands, tossed it clattering onto the rocks, and slammed a new one home. It took 18 seconds. It felt like 18 hours. But the enemy was relentless. They kept coming. Val kept firing. The SEALs, seeing their mechanic turn into a one-woman air support platform, found their second wind. They formed a perimeter around the DPV and added their rifles to the firestorm. For 20 minutes, the firefight raged. Val's arms burned with exhaustion. Her ears were ringing so loudly she couldn't hear the screams anymore, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. These were her boys, her unit, her family. Then, as suddenly as it started, the enemy fire began to slacken. The attackers, seeing their momentum shattered by an insane woman on a machine gun and a handful of determined SEALs, started to melt back into the rocks, dragging their dead. They had lost over 50 fighters. Val had killed or wounded at least half of them herself. The silence that followed was deafening. Val slumped against the gun mount, her body shaking uncontrollably. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in a layer of grime, gunpowder, and blood. She looked at the DPV. It was riddled with bullet holes. The tires were shredded. The engine was smoking, but it was still running. It had done its job. Havoc walked up to the vehicle, his rifle hanging at his side. He looked at the pile of enemy bodies littering the slope. He looked at the glowing barrel of the machine gun. He looked at Val. There were no words big enough. He simply reached up, placed a hand on her greasy, sweat-soaked shoulder, and nodded. Val nodded back. The mechanic had just rewritten the definition of vehicle maintenance. The medevac helicopters finally arrived, their rotors beating the air like the wings of angels. As they loaded the wounded, one of the young pilots looked at the wrecked DPV and the exhausted, blood-spattered woman sitting on its hood. "What the hell happened here?" he asked a SEAL. The SEAL, Murphy, his chest wound packed and bandaged, managed a weak smile. "That," he said, pointing at Val, "is just our mechanic. She came to fix us." Val didn't hear him. She was already looking at the smoking engine of the DPV, her mind shifting gears from survival back to mechanics. It was a good machine. It deserved to be fixed, and she was the one to do it.